The wind howled through the crumbling stone walls of the ancient castle, echoing a desolate sound that seemed to carry the whispers of the past. The massive iron gates creaked as if in protest, unable to shut out the nightmare brewing within. The ground, still wet from the evening rain, was slick beneath the feet of the soldiers standing in grim silence. They dared not speak, not in the presence of their master, not on this night. At the center of the castle courtyard, an enormous pit loomed, its jagged edges almost like the open maw of some great beast, awaiting its next meal. A sickening stench of blood and decay clung to the air, and the rustling sound of movement from within the pit only added to the oppressive atmosphere. But it was not the creatures below that held the attention of those present. It was the man who stood at the edge of the pit, looking down with cold detachment, his eyes fixed on a figure bound and trembling in the hands of two of his most trusted men. This man, Lord X, was no stranger to cruelty. He had wielded power over this land with an iron fist for years. His methods were brutal, his thirst for control unyielding, and his reign had been marked by an unrelenting desire to break the will of those who dared oppose him. His subjects lived in fear, not just of his temper, but of his cunning mind, which seemed to anticipate every move, every rebellion, long before it could take shape. Yet, despite the terror he had instilled in his people, there was something more dangerous about him than mere ruthlessness. There was a darkness within him, a hunger that extended beyond the physical world, into the very realm of the supernatural. The woman, the captive, stood on the cold stone, shivering not just from the chill of the night but from a deeper terror that had taken root in her heart. She had been dragged from her family's estate only days ago, her life now a mere pawn in the cruel game being played by Lord X. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back, the rough ropes cutting into her skin. She had once been a woman of nobility, of grace and strength, but now she stood before the pit like a helpless animal awaiting slaughter. She had heard the rumors, of course. The stories that passed from town to town about the ruler's unholy rituals, of how he used human sacrifices to maintain his power. And now, she was to be the latest victim. She could feel the hot breath of the animals below, their growls sending shivers up her spine. But it wasn't the fear of death itself that gripped her. No, it was the eerie sense that something far darker than mere violence hung in the air, something she couldn't quite understand. Lord X took a step forward, his boots echoing in the empty courtyard. The wind seemed to die down for a brief moment, and in that strange stillness, he spoke, his voice low and commanding. "The gods demand a price," he said, his words carrying a weight that seemed to press down on all who heard them. "And I will pay it, for the power I seek is worth any sacrifice." His eyes, cold and unfeeling, turned to the woman, and for a moment, something flickered there, something almost like a shadow of doubt, quickly suppressed. He motioned to his soldiers, who roughly pushed the woman forward. She stumbled but did not fall. Her gaze remained fixed on the pit, where the shadows of hungry creatures writhed beneath the surface. They had been waiting for this moment, their claws scraping against the stone in anticipation. The ritual was about to begin, and the final act of her tragic fate was near. As she was forced to step closer to the edge, her heart raced, each beat a reminder of her helplessness. She had heard of the pit before, though she never truly believed the tales. It was said that the animals within were unlike any other, ferocious, unrelenting in their hunger, and wild beyond control. The common people spoke of them as though they were beasts from some other world, born of darkness and night. To be cast into the pit was a death sentence, but to be thrown into it alive was something far worse. But it was not the creatures below that terrified her most, it was the unknown. Lord X had made this decision with cold calculation, but it was the forces he had summoned, the ancient and forgotten powers, that filled her with the deepest dread. She had been raised to believe in the tangible world, the world of kingdoms and rulers, of soldiers and wars. But now, standing on the precipice of the pit, she felt the pull of something ancient, something beyond understanding. She had heard stories of the old rituals, of sacrifices made to gods long forgotten, and of curses that followed those who dared disturb the natural order. The soldiers, their faces grim, released their hold on her. She stood at the edge of the pit now, her legs trembling beneath her as she faced the abyss below. The pit seemed to deepen, its darkness swallowing the very light of the moon. She could hear the growls and snarls of the creatures beneath her, and in that moment, she understood, this was not a simple execution. No, Lord X's intentions were far more sinister. She was not just a pawn in a game of political power, she was part of something darker, a ritual that had been in the making for centuries. A strange sound echoed from the pit, a sound not of animal hunger but of something else, something older, something malevolent. It was as though the pit itself was alive, waiting for her. And then, as if summoned by her terror, the creatures below erupted in a frenzy. The ground shook, the air thick with a primal energy. The ropes that bound her wrists were loosened, and she was given one final, chilling choice, to be cast into the pit of rage, or to face the wrath of Lord X's unforgiving rule. But as she stared into the depths, something changed in her. It was as if she could sense the malevolence growing within the castle itself, the sinister force that had been feeding off Lord X's actions. The air seemed to grow heavier, the very walls of the fortress seeming to close in on her. In that moment, something deep within her broke, but it was not just fear that filled her. There was a sudden clarity, an understanding that her fate was tied not just to the violence of Lord X but to something far older, far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The air hummed with a strange energy, and the ground trembled as though the earth itself was protesting what was about to happen. And then, without another word, she was cast into the abyss. The scream that followed would haunt the halls of the castle for years to come, for it was not just the scream of a woman facing her death, but the cry of something awakening, something ancient, something hungry. The curse had been set in motion. And what followed would change everything. The wind howled again, louder this time, as though it, too, had heard the call of the unseen forces. The pit had claimed its victim, but in the process, it had also claimed something else, the fragile balance of power that had once ruled over the land. As the castle stood silent, the echoes of that night lingered in the stone walls, waiting to be uncovered by those who would seek the truth of what happened here. What had truly been set in motion that fateful night? The answer would not be simple, and the repercussions would be felt for generations to come. But for now, only the wind knew, and it carried the secret to places where even the darkest shadows could not reach. The castle, perched precariously on the jagged cliffside, seemed to grow out of the very rock it stood upon, its towers reaching into the sky like the spires of a long-forgotten cathedral. From a distance, it was a magnificent sight, a symbol of strength and power that had withstood centuries of storms, battles, and shifting political tides. But as one drew closer, the grandeur of its stone facade began to crack and peel away, revealing a structure that was as much a monument to decay as to dominion. The outer walls, once painted in vibrant hues, now stood dulled and weathered, the marks of time etched deep into the stone. The battlements, which once rang with the sounds of victory and defense, had fallen silent, abandoned by the soldiers who had once manned them. Within the castle, the air was heavy with the smell of mildew and damp earth, the stone floors cold to the touch. The flickering glow of torchlight danced across the walls, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch out of the past itself. The rooms, once regal and full of life, had now been reduced to empty chambers, where the echoes of forgotten laughter and whispered secrets hung like the lingering remnants of a ghost. The silence was oppressive, as though the castle itself had grown tired, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness that had taken over. The story of this fortress was not one of quiet decline, however. It had been built during an age of expansion, when kings and lords sought to solidify their rule by constructing fortresses that could withstand the forces of nature and human ambition alike. Lord X's ancestors were no different. They had come to this land with the intent to conquer, to build an empire that would last for eternity. The castle was the seat of their power, a beacon of their dominance over the surrounding lands. And for many years, it served its purpose, imposing, unyielding, and unassailable. Yet beneath its imposing exterior, there were cracks, and they weren't just in the stonework. The history of the castle was tangled with bloodshed and treachery, a legacy written not in noble deeds but in betrayal and sacrifice. It was said that the first lord to reside in the castle, Lord Hargrave, had built it atop an ancient burial ground, a site of old pagan rituals and dark sacrifices. The locals, superstitious and wary, had warned him of the consequences of disturbing the sacred ground, but he had ignored their pleas, believing that his power would shield him from any consequence. For a time, it seemed he was right. He ruled with an iron fist, expanding his domain and wealth, until one fateful night, when something twisted and ancient awoke beneath the stone. No one knew exactly what happened to Lord Hargrave, but it was said that he disappeared without a trace. His disappearance was blamed on a rival noble, a man who had sought to claim the castle for himself. However, whispers among the servants and townsfolk told a different story, one of dark rituals, strange happenings, and the wrath of something older than the kingdom itself. After his disappearance, his heirs took control, but they were never able to shake the shadow that seemed to follow them. The castle's power remained undeniable, but its cost was steep. The lords who followed were never the same. They were haunted by the ghost of their ancestor, Lord Hargrave, and by the forces he had inadvertently unleashed. As the centuries passed, the castle's legacy grew darker. The line of succession was marred by violence, madness, and unexplained deaths. The families who held the title of lord or lady came and went, each meeting an untimely or tragic end. The common folk, fearful of the castle's ominous reputation, dared not venture near, even as its towering presence loomed over the surrounding village. It was said that the cursed nature of the castle seeped into the land, warping the very soil, leaving the crops twisted and failing, and the animals growing restless and wild. The villagers, desperate for relief, whispered of old gods, dark magic, and ancient powers that sought to reclaim what had been disturbed. Lord X, the latest in the long line of rulers, had grown up hearing these stories. The tales of his ancestors' hubris and their inevitable downfall had been drilled into him from a young age, yet they seemed little more than myths, exaggerated by frightened peasants. He had always considered himself different, more capable than his forebears. He was determined to break the cycle of tragedy, to prove that his rule would be one of prosperity, not one of shadow and superstition. But in his desire to secure his legacy and ensure the survival of his family name, Lord X was blind to the forces at work around him. As a young man, he had been driven by ambition, eager to expand his father's lands and increase his power. The castle, with its imposing architecture and long history, seemed to promise everything he desired. It was a fortress not just of stone but of will, a physical manifestation of his desire to control not only the land but the very destiny of those who lived upon it. But as the years passed and his reign deepened, Lord X found himself surrounded by enemies, both foreign and domestic. And it was here, in the midst of his growing paranoia and political strife, that he turned to the dark rituals of his ancestors, believing they would provide the answer to his problems. The rituals had been lost to history, buried beneath layers of superstition and fear. Yet as his enemies closed in and his power began to wane, Lord X found himself desperate enough to seek them out. He consulted scholars, monks, and so-called seers who claimed to know the ancient ways. Through secretive and dangerous means, he uncovered fragments of the forgotten rites, the sacrifices that were meant to bind one's power to the land, to ensure dominion over life and death. He did not care that these rituals were the same ones his ancestors had used in their ill-fated attempts to cement their power. To him, they were a means to an end, a way to secure his rule and protect the future of his bloodline. But as he delved deeper into the mysteries of the castle, something began to change within him. The more he learned, the more the line between reality and the supernatural blurred. The walls of the castle seemed to breathe with a life of their own, the air growing thick with an unseen presence. His dreams became filled with visions of figures cloaked in shadow, of ancient gods whose names were forgotten to time. And as these forces began to take hold of his mind, Lord X's actions grew more erratic. His once dominant will became tainted by the influence of these dark entities, and in his madness, he made a fateful decision, one that would set the course for the tragic events to come. It was no longer enough for him to simply rule the land. No, now he sought something greater, absolute control, not just over his enemies, but over fate itself. In his desperation, he cast aside any remaining semblance of morality and turned to the unthinkable. The ancient rites would not merely secure his power, they would bind it to him in ways that would make him untouchable, unstoppable. But the cost of such power, as Lord X would soon discover, was far higher than he had ever imagined. The castle, once a symbol of his family's glory, had become a prison, both for him and for the very land it stood upon. The walls, steeped in centuries of blood and betrayal, seemed to watch him now, as though aware of the disaster that was unfolding within. And so, Lord X prepared to carry out the ultimate act that would, in his mind, ensure his legacy, one that would forever be etched in the dark annals of history. The final steps toward his ruin had begun, and the castle, that ancient and brooding structure, would bear witness to it all. Lord X was a man consumed by his ambition. From an early age, he had been taught that power was the only thing that mattered, that it was the measure of a man's worth and the key to survival. The lessons were drilled into him by his father, a man who ruled with the same cold detachment that defined Lord X's own rule. His father's reign had been one of calculated cruelty, a series of brutal campaigns and alliances that had only served to further cement their family's position among the nobility. But unlike his father, Lord X was not content with merely inheriting power. He was driven by an insatiable hunger to shape the world around him, to bend it to his will in ways that no one had done before. Growing up, Lord X had always felt a gnawing sense of inadequacy. No matter how much wealth, land, or influence he amassed, there was always the haunting knowledge that he was never truly in control. There were forces at play, things beyond his understanding, that threatened to undo everything he had worked for. As a child, he had heard the whispers of the castle's past, of its cursed history and the fates of his ancestors who had tried and failed to maintain the family's power. The stories spoke of betrayal, madness, and death, each tale more unsettling than the last. Yet, as he grew older, he became determined to break free from the shackles of his ancestors' mistakes. His mind, sharp and calculating, was capable of seeing patterns where others saw only chaos. He quickly learned how to manipulate the hearts and minds of those around him, playing the delicate game of politics with ease. He was a master of strategy, a commander who could see several moves ahead, and his reputation spread quickly. His enemies were few, and those who opposed him were either bought or crushed beneath the weight of his influence. He saw himself as destined for greatness, for an empire that would stand the test of time. Yet, in his quest for dominance, Lord X found himself surrounded by rivals. Not just the foreign kings and noble houses that sought to challenge his rule, but also those closest to him, his own vassals, his family members, and even his trusted advisors. These individuals, who had once pledged their loyalty to him, began to question his methods. They whispered among themselves that his thirst for power was consuming him, that his increasing reliance on strange, foreign rituals and forgotten traditions was proof that he was losing his grip on reality. But Lord X, blinded by his ambition and arrogance, dismissed their concerns. He believed that their doubts were nothing more than the whispers of those too weak to understand the magnitude of his vision. As the political climate grew more treacherous, Lord X began to feel the weight of the kingdom's instability. Revolts were on the horizon, the common folk growing restless under his rule. Droughts, poor harvests, and famine had gripped the land, and the people were increasingly turning against him. His advisors warned him of the need to address these issues, of the necessity of appearing merciful, of restoring faith in his leadership. But Lord X saw these problems as nothing more than a temporary inconvenience, one that could be solved with a few military campaigns and the strategic use of fear. Yet, as his enemies grew bolder, Lord X began to see that fear alone was not enough to maintain control. The legends of his ancestors, the dark rituals and sacrifices that had been whispered about in the castle's hallways, began to take on new meaning for Lord X. It was no longer just a matter of keeping his enemies at bay, it was a matter of ensuring his own survival. The rituals had been buried beneath centuries of superstition and fear, but Lord X, in his desperation, began to uncover fragments of these ancient rites. He sought out old scholars and monks, men who claimed to have knowledge of the forbidden arts. Some of them were charlatans, of course, peddling stories of old magic and ancient gods for a price. But others, more dangerous and more secretive, claimed to possess the knowledge Lord X so desperately needed. The more he learned, the more he became convinced that these rituals held the key to his ultimate power. He believed that through these rites, he could transcend the limitations of mortality itself, that he could bind the very forces of nature to his will. The power that his ancestors had sought but never fully grasped was now within his reach. But the cost of this power was steep. It was not something that could be gained through mere willpower or force. It required sacrifice, blood, pain, and the offering of something precious. Lord X, however, was willing to pay any price. The kingdom, his legacy, and his very soul were worth it. He began to perform the rituals in secret, away from the eyes of his court and advisors. Late at night, when the castle was shrouded in darkness and silence, Lord X would retreat to the depths of the castle's ancient halls, where the old rites had once been carried out. There, in the cold and oppressive air, he would invoke the forgotten gods, calling upon their power in the hopes of bending the world to his will. The rituals were long and complex, each step requiring precise timing and the correct offerings. Some days, he would burn incense and recite ancient chants, invoking the spirits of the earth and the sky. Other times, he would sacrifice animals, their blood staining the stone floors in a macabre display of devotion. The more he practiced these rituals, the more he felt a strange connection to the forces he was invoking. It was as though the very walls of the castle responded to his prayers, the stone vibrating with an energy he could not fully comprehend. But as Lord X delved deeper into the rituals, something began to change within him. The power he sought was intoxicating, and with each ritual, he felt his sense of self slip away, replaced by a growing sense of invincibility. The lines between reality and the supernatural began to blur, and the more he sought control, the more it seemed that control was slipping through his fingers. He no longer trusted anyone, not his advisors, not his soldiers, not even his family. They were all potential threats to his reign, and he saw enemies in every shadow. His paranoia grew to dangerous levels. He began to see enemies everywhere, even among those closest to him. His own family, the very bloodline he was trying to protect, became targets in his eyes. The rituals, once seen as a means to secure his future, had become an obsession, a dark force that threatened to consume him. The castle, too, seemed to change under his reign. The once proud fortress had become a labyrinth of cold stone and shadows, filled with hidden rooms and forgotten passages, where Lord X could conduct his rituals in private. He spent more and more time alone, growing increasingly isolated from the world outside. And it was during this time, in the midst of his growing madness, that he learned of the prisoner, the woman who would become the center of his darkest and most twisted ritual. She was a pawn, of course, a mere tool in his grand design. But to him, she represented something more. She was the catalyst for the final step in his transformation, the ultimate offering that would bind his power to the very forces he had been courting. Lord X was no longer just a man, he was a vessel for something ancient and terrible, something beyond human understanding. And the woman, the captive, would be the final piece in the puzzle that would allow him to transcend mortality itself. The decision was made. Her fate was sealed the moment she crossed the threshold of the castle's gates. Lord X saw her not as a person, but as a necessary sacrifice. He would cast her into the pit, allowing the ritual to reach its terrifying conclusion. The power he sought would be his, and nothing, no one, would be able to stop him. The news of the captive's arrival at the castle spread quickly through the halls and chambers, carried by the whispers of servants and soldiers who dared to speak in hushed tones. She was an unfamiliar face in the fortress, her name scarcely mentioned in any official documents or meetings. Lord X had kept her arrival a secret, telling only his closest advisors that she was a woman of noble birth, someone with political value, a pawn in the larger game of his ambitions. Yet, even in the eyes of the most loyal of his men, there was something unsettling about her presence, something that felt almost otherworldly. She was not like the others, the women who had been brought to the castle as guests or prisoners in the past. There was an undeniable strength to her, a quiet resilience that came through in the way she carried herself despite the heavy burden of her captivity. Her eyes, dark and sharp, seemed to pierce through the gloom of the castle's stone walls, unflinching in their defiance. She was a woman of noble blood, certainly, her family a significant player in the political affairs of the realm. But it was her inner fortitude, her unwavering sense of dignity even in the face of her circumstances, that struck those who came into contact with her. Her name was Elira, and she had been taken from her family's estate under the cover of night, a bold move by Lord X, who sought to neutralize any potential threats to his growing power. Her family had been a key player in the intricate web of alliances and rivalries that shaped the kingdom. Elira's father, a wealthy landowner and skilled diplomat, had long been a thorn in Lord X's side, an obstacle that stood in the way of his complete dominance over the region. Lord X had always suspected that Elira's father was plotting against him, seeking to undermine his authority through clandestine alliances with neighboring lords. The betrayal, however, ran deeper than simple political maneuvering. Elira's father had been a secret follower of the old ways, of the ancient rituals that Lord X himself had begun to explore. When Elira was taken, her family was thrown into disarray. Her father had been ill, bedridden for months before her capture, and her mother, now a frail woman, could offer little resistance. The family's retainers and soldiers, loyal only to the head of the household, could do nothing to prevent her abduction. Elira's capture was swift and brutal, a message to any who might consider defying Lord X in the future. She was no longer just a noblewoman, she was a symbol of the power Lord X wielded, a captive who would ensure her family's compliance and silence. But Elira, even in chains, had never been one to bow to threats. Her resolve only strengthened in the face of danger. From the moment she entered the castle's gates, she knew that her fate was sealed. The castle, with its towering walls and oppressive shadows, had always been a place of fear and superstition. The stories of its cursed past, the whispers of dark rituals and forgotten gods, were well known. And now she, too, was part of that macabre history. The first few days in the castle were a blur of confusion and fear. Elira was placed in a cold, windowless cell deep within the bowels of the fortress, far from the eyes of the court. She was not granted the luxuries afforded to other prisoners or guests of the castle. Her food was sparse, and the guards who brought it to her were silent, their faces hidden beneath hoods. No one spoke to her, save for the occasional cryptic remark from the castle's chamberlain, a man who seemed to know more than he let on. His eyes always lingered a little too long on her, and the way he spoke, as though she were already dead, made her uneasy. In the solitude of her prison, Elira had plenty of time to reflect on her situation, to sift through the fragments of information she had gathered over the years about Lord X and the castle's dark history. She had heard the rumors, of course, tales of a ruler so ruthless that even his closest allies had come to fear him. There were whispers of his obsession with the occult, of his willingness to use forbidden magic to maintain his rule. But she never truly believed them, not until now. Now, trapped within these ancient walls, the truth of those stories seemed all too real. Elira's mind, sharp as it was, had always been attuned to patterns, to subtle clues that others might miss. And as the days passed, she began to notice odd things about the castle, things that set her on edge, things that spoke of forces beyond the mortal realm. The servants, when they spoke to her, were always careful, their words laced with fear. Even the guards who brought her food would not meet her eyes, as though they were afraid of what they might see. And there was the castle itself, the way it seemed to watch her, its stone walls feeling almost alive, as though they held secrets too terrible to reveal. Elira began to have dreams. Strange, vivid dreams that seemed to pull her deeper into the castle's history, into its darkest corners. In these dreams, she saw shadows moving in the corners of her vision, heard whispers in languages she did not understand, and felt a cold presence pressing in from all sides. These were not ordinary dreams, they were visions, glimpses of something ancient, something buried deep beneath the castle's foundations. At first, she dismissed them as the result of stress and hunger, but the more they persisted, the more she came to believe that they were a warning. Then, one night, something happened that made her realize the true depth of her predicament. She had been in her cell, staring at the flickering torchlight when the door creaked open, and a shadowed figure entered. It was not a guard, nor the chamberlain, but a man she had never seen before. Tall, with dark, piercing eyes, he seemed to glide across the floor, his movements unnaturally smooth. He did not speak at first, merely observing her, his gaze cold and calculating. "Elira," he said finally, his voice low and measured. "You don't know why you are here, do you?" The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elira's heart skipped a beat. She had never been told the reason for her imprisonment, only that she was to be kept in isolation, away from the eyes of the castle's court. But now, this stranger seemed to know something more, something she did not. "I know why you're here," he continued, his eyes narrowing. "You are more than just a prisoner, more than just a pawn in Lord X's game. You are a key to something much older than this kingdom, something far older than Lord X himself." His words struck her like a blow. She had always suspected that Lord X's ambitions were not entirely of this world, that there was something beyond politics driving him. But this man's words confirmed her fears. She was not just a captive in a political war, she was part of a far larger and more dangerous scheme. The man continued, his voice becoming more urgent. "You must understand, Elira, that this place, this castle, is not merely a home to Lord X. It is a prison, a place of great power. The rituals he has begun are not just about power, they are about something much darker. He has awoken something that was never meant to be disturbed. And now, he seeks to use you to finish what he started." Elira's mind raced, her pulse quickening. She had always known that there was something wrong with Lord X, something that went beyond his political ambitions, but she never imagined that it was tied to the castle itself, to the very land they stood on. The pit, the sacrifices, the strange rituals, it all began to make sense in a terrifying way. Lord X had not just been seeking power, he had been summoning something. The man stepped closer, his eyes boring into hers. "You are the final piece," he said. "The ritual requires you. Your blood, your essence, it will complete what Lord X has begun." Elira's heart stopped. She had heard the rumors, but now they seemed all too real. She was not merely a prisoner, she was a sacrifice, a key to some ancient power that Lord X had unwittingly unleashed. And as the realization sank in, Elira understood the full weight of her situation. Escape was impossible. But survival? That was something else entirely. She would not allow herself to be a mere pawn in Lord X's game. She would find a way to survive, to turn the tables on the man who had thought her just a pawn to be discarded. The days began to stretch on, and as Elira's situation grew more dire, her mind grew more focused, more resolute. The cold, damp cell that she had once dreaded now seemed to offer a strange comfort, a solitude where she could think, away from the prying eyes and ears of the castle's inhabitants. But the longer she stayed, the more she realized that her captors, whoever they were, whoever served Lord X, were growing increasingly unnerved by her quiet defiance. The whispers among the servants became more frequent, and their faces betrayed a level of anxiety that she had not seen before. It was as if they were afraid of something, something beyond the reach of the lord they served. It was no longer just the physical threats of the castle that pressed down upon her, it was a growing unease, a sense of foreboding that lingered in every shadow. One evening, as the torchlight flickered weakly along the stone walls, she sat cross-legged on the cold floor of her cell, staring at the cracked window that barely allowed any moonlight through. The air was thick with the scent of mold, and a low, distant rumble of thunder echoed from the horizon, warning of the storms to come. The dreams had intensified in the past few nights, dreams that now felt more like memories than figments of her imagination. They were no longer vague images and distant whispers, they were detailed, precise, and visceral. She could see the rituals being performed, the twisted shadows moving in the corners of her vision, and most haunting of all, the distant cry of a woman, her own voice, echoing in the chambers of the castle as though trapped in time. It was as if she had already been part of the ritual, a prelude to something terrible. Despite the terrifying nature of these dreams, they also offered Alira something she hadn't had in days: clarity. The pieces were slowly coming together, and she began to realize the extent of the forces that were at play in the castle, and the reason behind her capture. The man who had visited her, his words now ringing in her ears, had not been wrong. Lord X's obsession with power was not rooted solely in the material world, it was about far darker forces, the very foundations of which seemed to lie beneath the castle itself. Alira began to piece together the legends of the castle's origins. She recalled the stories her father had told her when she was younger, stories that had once seemed like folklore, tales spun from the imagination of a family obsessed with history. But now, in the shadow of Lord X's increasing madness, the myths seemed all too real. The castle had been built upon an ancient and sacred site, one that had been consecrated by rituals and ceremonies long forgotten by most of the kingdom. The land itself was steeped in blood, and its foundations were said to have been laid with the bones of the past. Her family's connection to the castle was far deeper than she had realized. The rituals performed here were not simple acts of devotion or superstition, they were the remnants of a cult, an ancient and powerful sect that had once ruled these lands, using magic that stretched beyond mortal understanding. Lord X, desperate to secure his rule, had unwittingly become entangled in a force far beyond his control, a force that sought not to elevate him, but to consume him. The pit in the center of the castle's courtyard, the one that had once held a prisoner, was not merely a pit of execution or a tool of fear. It was a portal, a gateway to something older and far more dangerous than anything Lord X had imagined. And now, Alira realized, she was to be the final offering. Her blood, her life force, would complete the ritual that would bind Lord X's soul to the ancient powers that lay dormant beneath the castle. She had been chosen, not just for her lineage, but for her connection to the castle's cursed legacy. The cult of old had known that to truly harness the power of the land, they would need a vessel, someone pure enough to hold the forces they sought to control, someone whose bloodline had been touched by both the gods and the darkness that ran beneath the soil. It was a role Alira had never asked for, a fate she would never have chosen, but it was a role she was now tied to irrevocably. Alira had no illusions. The Lord she had once known, the man she had heard of through whispers and stories, was no more. Lord X was no longer human, he had become a vessel, a puppet, a servant to the forces that had begun to twist him. His mind had already cracked under the pressure of his obsession with power, and now, the ritual he had begun would consume him entirely. He had set in motion something that even he could not control. But Alira was not the helpless captive she had once been. Something had shifted within her, something deep and primal, as the realization dawned on her. She had the power to stop this. She may not have had the strength to fight Lord X directly, nor could she overpower his soldiers, but there were other ways to resist, ways to subvert the power he sought to summon. The knowledge she had gleaned from her dreams, from the cryptic words of the man who had visited her, now gave her the insight she needed to act. She had learned enough of the ancient rituals to know that they were not without their flaws, their weaknesses. The forces that Lord X was trying to control had their own laws, their own methods, and Alira knew that if she could find the right leverage, the right way to disrupt the ritual, she could prevent it from coming to fruition. The storm outside grew fiercer, the rain now pounding against the stone walls of the castle, as if nature itself were warning her. Alira felt the urge to act quickly. The time was coming, she could sense it, could feel the shift in the air. It was as though the castle itself were awakening, responding to Lord X's machinations. She had to move before it was too late. But the question remained, how? How could she escape her cell, how could she infiltrate the heart of the castle where the ritual was to be performed, when the very walls seemed to close in on her at every turn? But then, in the midst of her despair, a small crack appeared in the fortress of her isolation. The castle's inhabitants, in their fear and disarray, had begun to slip up. The guards had become less attentive, the routines less rigid. The servants who once hurried through the halls with their heads down had begun to talk openly, their conversations rife with unease. It was clear that Lord X's control was slipping, his obsession with the ritual had driven him to madness, and in his madness, he had begun to unravel the threads of his own power. His once airtight rule was now full of holes, and Elira knew she could use this to her advantage. One evening, after the last meal had been brought to her, Elira noticed something, a small key, lying forgotten on the floor near her door. It was a simple thing, no more than a basic iron key, but in that moment, it was a symbol of hope. She had no idea how it had ended up there, but she knew without hesitation that it was the key to her escape. Her heart raced as she picked it up, testing its weight in her hand. This was it. This was her chance. With a quiet breath, Elira approached the door of her cell. The key slid into the lock with ease, and for a moment, she froze, listening for any sounds of movement in the halls beyond. She could hear nothing. The silence that had once terrified her now seemed to offer her a strange comfort, as though it were her ally. Slowly, she turned the key and opened the door, the hinges creaking softly in protest. She slipped out into the corridor, her pulse quickening. Her escape was not going to be easy. The castle's labyrinthine halls were treacherous, and every step she took seemed to echo in the silence. But Elira had no choice, she had to move quickly, before Lord X could complete the ritual. She knew that the fate of not just the castle but the entire kingdom rested on her shoulders. As she moved deeper into the heart of the castle, her mind raced with the knowledge of what she had to do next. She could already feel the presence of the forces that had begun to awaken beneath the castle, their dark energy pulsating through the walls, reaching for her. It would be a battle against time, against the forces of magic and madness that threatened to consume everything. But Elira was no longer the helpless prisoner. She was a woman on a mission to save herself, her family, and the kingdom from a fate far worse than death. Elira's heart pounded in her chest as she crept through the shadowy hallways of the castle. Every sound seemed to reverberate too loudly, every footstep too heavy. She moved as silently as possible, careful to avoid the faintest squeak of the stone floors beneath her. Her eyes darted back and forth, scanning the darkness, ever aware of the possibility that a guard could appear at any moment. She knew she had no time to waste. The key she had found, her only lifeline, was her sole chance to escape the prison she had been thrown into. But it also came with the knowledge that once she was discovered missing, there would be no going back. She had to move swiftly, decisively, and with purpose. The corridors of the castle twisted and turned like a maze, each passage darker and more oppressive than the last. The flickering torches along the walls did little to chase away the shadows that seemed to grow deeper with each step. Elira, who had once considered this place to be the seat of power, now saw it for what it truly was, a tomb, a place where life was suffocated by the weight of its own history. The air was heavy, thick with the centuries of bloodshed and fear that had soaked into these stones. The very walls seemed to groan under the burden of the castle's dark past, as if warning her to turn back, to give in to the inevitable. But Elira would not, could not, turn back. There was too much at stake. She had learned enough in her time in the castle to know that Lord X's descent into madness was no accident. His obsession with power, his fixation on the old rituals and dark forces, had led him to a point of no return. What had started as a thirst for control had morphed into a dangerous pursuit of something far more sinister, something that threatened not just his rule, but the very fabric of reality itself. Lord X had already begun the ritual, and its completion would unleash forces that would forever change the course of history. The ancient power that lay dormant beneath the castle, the power that had been sealed away for centuries, was stirring once more. And Elira, though she had only begun to grasp the full extent of the ritual's significance, knew that she had to stop it. If she failed, the consequences would be catastrophic, not just for her, but for everyone in the kingdom. As Elira moved through the castle, she couldn't help but think back to the man who had warned her, the stranger who had visited her cell, whose cryptic words had planted the seeds of doubt in her mind. He had spoken of ancient gods, forgotten powers, and rituals that were beyond human comprehension. He had spoken of a power so old that even Lord X could not control it, a force that would consume him if he wasn't careful. But Alira also understood that the man had been trying to manipulate her in his own way. He had told her that she was the key to stopping the ritual, but he had also made it clear that her role was not as simple as she had hoped. She wasn't just a victim in this story, she was also a part of it, tied to the fate of the castle, to the land itself. The walls of the castle seemed to close in on her, the shadows growing ever more oppressive. Alira's mind raced as she searched for any semblance of a plan. The ritual was set to take place in the castle's inner sanctum, a hidden chamber deep within the bowels of the fortress. It was said to be a place of immense power, where the ancient rites had once been performed, where sacrifices had been made in the name of the old gods. Alira had never been inside, but she had heard enough stories to know that it was a place of terrible significance, a place where life and death could be twisted to serve a dark purpose. As she neared the castle's heart, Alira felt a cold chill settle over her, as though the very air itself were charged with a sinister energy. She could almost taste the darkness, feel it pressing in on her, urging her to turn away. But she would not be swayed. She had to stop Lord X, no matter the cost. She had no idea what awaited her inside the sanctum, but she knew that the ritual could not be allowed to reach its final stage. The path grew more narrow as she descended deeper into the bowels of the castle. The walls, once smooth and imposing, were now rough and jagged, as though the very foundation of the castle had been built upon an unstable ground. The torches burned dimly, casting weak pools of light that barely illuminated the path before her. Alira's senses were heightened now, her every movement slow and calculated. She could hear her breath in the stillness, the faint scrape of her shoes on the stone floor, the distant murmur of the storm still raging outside. It was as though the castle itself was alive, watching her every step, anticipating her next move. At the end of the hallway, Alira found a heavy wooden door, its surface scarred with age and wear. She pressed her ear to it, listening for any sounds from within. There was nothing, no voices, no footsteps, no indication that anyone was nearby. With a steady hand, she reached for the door's iron handle and twisted it. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. The room was vast, far larger than she had expected, and filled with an oppressive silence. The walls were covered in strange symbols, markings that Alira could not recognize, their meanings lost to time. At the far end of the room stood a massive stone altar, its surface slick with an unnatural sheen. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the scent of incense and something more, something metallic, almost like blood. Lord X stood at the altar, his back to her. He was clad in robes that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, his hands raised high in the air as though calling upon the very heavens. His face, once handsome and strong, was now gaunt, twisted by the strain of his obsession. His eyes were wide, wild with madness, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Alira's heart skipped a beat as she saw the ritual unfold before her. The room was filled with shadows, strange and shifting, as though the very walls were alive with some kind of malevolent force. There were no servants, no guards, no witnesses to this act, just the two of them, alone in the heart of the castle. And yet, despite the isolation, Alira could feel the weight of the ritual pressing down on her. She could feel the darkness that Lord X was attempting to summon, the ancient power that he believed would give him dominion over life and death. She had no plan, no weapon, nothing to stop him. But there was one thing she could do, one thing that might interrupt the ritual and shatter his hold on the power he sought. It was a desperate gamble, but it was her only chance. Alira stepped forward, her bare feet silent on the stone floor. She did not know what to expect, but she knew that if she allowed Lord X to complete the ritual, all would be lost. With every ounce of strength she had left, she sprinted toward the altar, shouting his name in an attempt to break his concentration. "Lord X," she cried, her voice breaking the eerie silence of the chamber. "You don't know what you're doing. This is not the power you seek." Lord X's head snapped around, his eyes wide with shock and fury. But it was too late. The moment he turned to face her, the ritual began to unravel. The shadows in the room writhed, their shapes twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. The air grew cold, the temperature plummeting as if the very life force of the castle was being drained away. "No!" Lord X roared, his voice filled with rage. "You fool! You've ruined everything." Alira could feel the power surging around her, could see the force of the ritual collapsing in on itself. The shadows seemed to recoil, the air thick with a terrible, suffocating energy. But just as quickly as it had begun, the energy faded, leaving only a heavy silence in its wake. The storm outside continued to rage, but within the castle, everything had gone still. Lord X stumbled backward, his hands dropping to his sides as the last remnants of the ritual's power dissipated. The madness that had consumed him seemed to vanish in an instant, replaced by a hollow emptiness. He looked at Alira with a mixture of disbelief and defeat, as though the very foundations of his existence had been shattered. You've stopped it," he whispered, his voice cracking. Alira stood there, trembling but resolute. She had succeeded. The ritual had been disrupted, and Lord X's madness had been broken. But as she gazed at him, she knew that the castle would never be the same. The power that had once lurked beneath its walls had been disturbed, and the forces that had once driven Lord X would not easily be quelled. The legacy of the castle, its blood-soaked past, would continue to haunt the land, just as the darkness that had consumed Lord X would linger in the shadows. But for now, she had won. The nightmare had ended. And she had lived to see another dawn. The calm that followed the ritual's collapse was deceptive. The stillness in the chamber was more oppressive than the chaos that had filled it moments before. Alira's breath was ragged, the tension in her chest slowly ebbing as she realized the full weight of what she had done. The room around her, once filled with swirling darkness and an overpowering energy, had returned to its lifeless state, its cold, jagged stone walls offering no warmth or comfort. Lord X stood before her, a shell of the man he had been. His once grandiose figure seemed diminished, his eyes hollow and wild with the aftermath of the ritual's failure. Alira could feel her legs trembling beneath her, the adrenaline of her daring intervention beginning to fade, leaving exhaustion in its wake. The urgency that had driven her now seemed distant, as though the battle had been fought and won in some other lifetime. But there was no time to rest. No time for relief. The storm outside still raged, the wind howling against the ancient stone of the castle, as though nature itself refused to yield. The castle felt like a tomb, silent and heavy, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for them both to make the next move. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Lord X's gaze was fixed on her, his face a mask of disbelief, as though he could not quite comprehend what had just transpired. Alira stood her ground, even as her body screamed for rest. She could still hear the faint echoes of the ritual, the whispers of dark gods that had once filled the air, the sense of something ancient, something terrible, lingering just beneath the surface of the earth. The power that had almost consumed Lord X was still there, still tethered to the castle's cursed foundation. It would take more than a single interruption to fully rid the land of it. Alira knew that the battle was not truly over. "What have you done?" Lord X's voice was low, almost a growl, his breath coming in ragged bursts. His fingers twitched at his sides as if he were reaching for something that no longer existed. The man who had once been a figure of immense power, a ruler feared and admired across the kingdom, now seemed like little more than a broken shell. He had been consumed by his own ambition, swallowed whole by the forces he had sought to control. But even now, in his diminished state, there was something dangerous about him, something that Alira could not quite shake. "I stopped you," Alira replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I stopped you from destroying everything, yourself, this place, and everything in it. You don't understand what you were dealing with. You don't know the price of what you tried to summon." Lord X's eyes narrowed as he took a step toward her, his movements slow but deliberate. He had no power left, no magic to draw on. But there was still something in the way he looked at her, something that made Alira instinctively take a step back. She knew he was dangerous, even now, even in this state. He had always been consumed by the need for control, the desire to shape the world to his will. But it was clear now that he had lost that power, and without it, he was nothing. "You think you've won," Lord X sneered, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You think stopping the ritual has undone everything? That you've saved yourself, saved this land? You're a fool. The castle, the land, it will never be free of what's buried here. You can't stop it. You can only delay it. The power beneath this place is ancient. And I was the one who was meant to control it." Alira's heart skipped a beat as his words sank in. She had suspected as much. The rituals, the madness that had gripped him, it was not just about ambition. Lord X had been obsessed with something more, something older. The land itself, the very stones that made up the castle, were tied to forces beyond human comprehension. Alira could feel it in the air, the faintest hum of power that lingered, just beneath the surface of reality. The ritual might have been disrupted, but the darkness beneath the castle was not gone. It still pulsed, still waited. And now, she understood, Lord X had been only a vessel, a mere puppet trying to harness that power. But even he could not control it. "You don't understand," Lord X continued, his voice now tinged with desperation. "I wasn't trying to control the land. I was trying to become part of it. To merge with it, to transcend the limitations of this mortal body. You think I did this for power, for wealth, for some petty reign? No, Alira. I did this for immortality. To become something more than human, something beyond this world." His words, twisted as they were, struck a chord with her. Alira had always known that Lord X's ambition was boundless, but she had never truly understood the depths of his obsession. The thirst for power, for control, those were natural human desires. But what he spoke of now was different. It was a madness, a drive to escape the natural order of life and death, to become something that no man was meant to be. It was a desire to transcend humanity itself, to take on the mantle of the gods. And it had driven him to the brink of destruction. "You're already dead," Alira said softly, almost to herself, as she took a step away from him. She knew it to be true. Lord X had already crossed a line that could never be undone. His soul, his mind, had been consumed by the very power he had sought to control. "You were never meant to wield that power, and now you've awakened it. You think you can control it, but it's beyond you. It's beyond all of us." For a long moment, Lord X said nothing. His eyes, once filled with ambition, now seemed hollow, as though the very essence of his being had been drained away. The desperation in his face shifted into something else, a quiet, unsettling resignation. He understood, at last. The power he had sought had not only eluded him, it had consumed him. And now, in the aftermath, it seemed there was no place left for him in the world he had once sought to control. "Then what happens now?" His voice was quieter, almost broken. "What do you plan to do? You cannot stop the forces that have been set in motion. The land will not be free of this curse, not as long as this castle stands. You will never be free, Alira." Alira took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words, but standing firm. The truth was, she had no idea what would happen now. She didn't have all the answers. She wasn't a sorceress, a priestess, or a scholar of the dark arts. She was just a woman, caught in a situation far beyond her understanding. But she knew one thing for certain: Lord X had been a tyrant, consumed by his own ambition, and his actions had already caused enough suffering. The ritual might have been stopped, but the legacy of this place, the power beneath it, could not be ignored. The castle's curse would continue to linger, unless it was destroyed, completely, utterly eradicated from the land. "I don't know what will happen," Alira replied, her voice steady now. But I'll make sure the castle's dark legacy ends here. This place must be purged, completely. Only then can the land be free. Lord X did not respond. His gaze turned away from her, his eyes scanning the chamber, as if seeing the castle for the first time. The stone altar, the markings on the walls, the shadows that still seemed to flicker and shift in the corners of the room, all of it seemed to weigh heavily on him. The storm outside raged on, the wind howling through the cracks of the castle's ancient walls, but within the sanctum, it was eerily silent. The ancient power that had once been so palpable now seemed to recede, its presence diminished, its hold over the castle slipping away. Alira knew that she could not destroy the castle on her own. She did not have the means to remove the power beneath it, nor the strength to tear down the walls of this ancient fortress. But she could begin the process. She could leave, rally support, warn the kingdom of what had happened here, and ensure that no one ever tried to awaken the power beneath the castle again. But for now, the storm raged on, and she knew that the darkest chapter of the castle's story had yet to be fully written. The storm outside had not abated. If anything, the howling winds and the relentless pounding of rain against the castle's ancient stones only seemed to mirror the turbulence within Alira's heart. Her mind raced, attempting to make sense of the aftermath, to grasp hold of what had just occurred. Lord X, the man she had once feared, stood before her, a mere shadow of his former self. The ritual he had so desperately sought to complete had crumbled, but the price of that victory was still unknown. The land, the castle, and even her own soul felt forever changed. She knew she could not stand in this place much longer, the castle's curse, its long-forgotten past, still clung to the air, thick and oppressive. But leaving was not an option. Not yet. Alira's gaze wandered across the chamber, lingering on the altar where Lord X had once stood in his fervent pursuit of immortality. The stone structure, now dark and cold, seemed to pulse with a lingering malevolence, as though the ancient power still sought to find a vessel through which to manifest. Despite Lord X's fall, Alira could sense that the ritual had left a mark on the land itself, a scar that would never fully heal. She could feel it deep in her bones, the way the very ground beneath her feet seemed to throb with an energy that refused to be silenced. Lord X, standing now as a broken man, seemed to be retreating inward, the fire of ambition that had once blazed within him reduced to a flicker. The overwhelming confidence, the mad determination that had driven him to this point, was gone. What remained was a man whose life had been consumed by his own desires, a man who had sought to transcend his mortality only to find himself caught in the web of forces beyond his comprehension. And now, as the reality of his failure settled in, he was left with nothing but the hollow ruins of his grand vision. "You've destroyed everything," Lord X whispered, his voice barely audible above the storm. He didn't look at Alira, but at the altar, his gaze vacant, distant. I thought I could control it. I thought I could become something more, something eternal. But now I've unleashed a power I cannot even begin to understand." Alira could not help but feel a flicker of pity for him, though it was quickly overshadowed by the fear of what the future might hold. She had seen Lord X as a tyrant, a man driven by greed and madness. But now, in the ruins of his plans, she saw only a broken man, a shell of his former self. She knew it was dangerous to sympathize with him. He had been ruthless, and there was no guarantee that his insanity would not resurface. But there was something tragic in his words, something that spoke of a life wasted in the pursuit of an impossible dream. "It's not over," Alira said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "You may have failed in your quest for immortality, but the power you sought is still here. And it's not finished with you yet." Lord X turned his eyes toward her, his face pale and drawn. There was no anger in his gaze now, only a deep and profound exhaustion. "You think I don't know that?" His voice cracked with a bitter laugh. "I've always known. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let go. I thought I could outsmart it, outlive it, control it. But it's too late. The power beneath this place, it's beyond me. Beyond any of us. Elira's heart tightened as she looked around the room. She could feel it now, the faintest vibration in the air, the pulse of something ancient, something that had been awakened by Lord X's actions. The storm outside seemed to swell with the force of it, the winds howling louder, the thunder crashing as if in response to the very foundation of the earth itself being disturbed. The power beneath the castle, the same force that had once granted the ancient rulers their strength, was stirring again. But this time, it was no longer under the control of the man who had sought to wield it. It was free. And that freedom was not a gift, it was a curse. Elira knew that the castle, the land on which it stood, and the people who lived within its shadow were all in grave danger. The ritual may have been stopped, but the darkness had already been set in motion. Lord X had been only a conduit for a force far older, and far more dangerous, than any human could comprehend. The land itself had been touched by this power, and now it seemed to be turning on those who had dared to awaken it. As Elira stood there, grappling with the weight of her responsibility, a sudden thought struck her. She could feel the ground beneath her feet shifting, the subtle tremors in the earth as though the castle were alive, its foundations shifting in response to the ancient forces it had been built upon. She couldn't stay here. The ritual had to be destroyed completely, the power that lay beneath the castle must be sealed away forever, or else it would continue to spread, infecting everything in its wake. But how could she do this? The knowledge she needed was buried in the past, hidden away in the castle's forgotten corners. She could not face this alone. Elira, Lord X's voice interrupted her thoughts. His eyes were locked on her now, his expression twisted in a mixture of sorrow and desperation. You can't do this. No one can. The power is too great. It will consume you, just as it consumed me. It's too dangerous. You should leave this place, while you still can. There's nothing left for you here. Elira shook her head, her resolve hardening. I can't leave. Not until I make sure that the castle's curse is ended once and for all. If I leave now, if I let this place stand, it will only rise again, stronger and more dangerous than before. Lord X's eyes flashed with something akin to fear, though it was quickly masked by the weariness that had overtaken him. You don't understand, Elira. I tried to destroy it, to harness it. But it's not something that can be controlled. You can't simply walk away from this. The land is cursed. The castle was built on the blood of the old gods, and their power is woven into its very stones. To destroy it would mean undoing everything, everything that has ever been built on this land. His words cut through her, but Elira's resolve did not falter. She had already seen the destruction that Lord X's actions had caused. She had felt the pulse of the dark forces beneath the castle's walls. She knew that the only way forward was to confront this power head-on, to face the darkness that had been unleashed. I know the risks, she said, her voice steady. But I'm not afraid. Not anymore. If I don't stop this now, if I don't find a way to undo the damage, the curse will continue to grow. It will spread beyond the castle and beyond the land. I may not have the answers, but I won't let this power continue to corrupt everything it touches. Lord X's expression softened for a moment, a fleeting glimpse of the man he had once been before his obsession had taken hold. But that softness was quickly replaced by a resigned grimace. Then you'll have to make a choice, Elira. The power beneath this place cannot be simply sealed away. To destroy it, to stop it, you will have to destroy the very foundation of the castle. And that means sacrificing everything. Everything this place stands for. Everything that's been built here. Elira looked around the chamber, her eyes lingering on the altar, on the ancient symbols carved into the walls, on the very stones that had once stood as a symbol of power and prestige. The weight of Lord X's words pressed down on her, but she knew what had to be done. She could no longer let the past dictate the future. The curse of the castle was not something that could be ignored. It had to be severed completely, even if it meant destroying everything Lord X had sought to build. Then I'll destroy it all, Alira said firmly, her voice resolute. This castle, this land, it's all built on blood, on lies, on a power that was never meant to be wielded by mortal hands. I'll stop it. I'll stop it for good. And with that, she turned away from Lord X and walked toward the door, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had made. There was no turning back now. The storm outside continued to rage, but Alira felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The curse of the castle, the dark legacy that had haunted the land for centuries, would be broken. She would make sure of it. The storm raged on, but Alira's journey had just begun.